Imagine you're strapped into a metal seat 20,000 feet over the Pacific. The engine in front of you is howling. The cockpit stinks of oil, cordite, and sweat. Ahead, the sky is full of specks, enemy aircraft, growing larger by the second. Your fuel is limited, your ammunition is finite, and you're about to do something that, to most pilots, would sound insane. You're going to fight without being able to see your own bullets. No colorful tracers. No bright streaks to walk your fire in. Just a glass gun sight, a closing enemy, and your own nerve. Would you trust yourself to do that? Alexander Vraciu did. On June 19, 1944, during what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, this U.S. Navy fighter pilot shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in just 8 minutes, using less ammunition than most of his fellow pilots burned just testing their guns after takeoff. His secret wasn't a new airplane or a better engine or some classified gadget. It was a choice. He ordered the warning bullets, the tracers, removed from his guns. In their place, he had his Hellcat loaded with 100% M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds. No glow, no colored streaks, just invisible fire. Why would the Navy's top ace willingly give up the thing that every gun camera film seems to glorify, the glowing streams of bullets arcing toward the enemy? And what did that decision tell us about the way war really works in the air? Let's go back to the beginning of that story. Before he became a name on the scoreboard, Alexander Vraciu was just a kid from East Chicago, Indiana. The son of Romanian immigrants, raised in a hard, industrial town, he wasn't born into the world of aviation. He clawed his way into it. He studied at DePaul University, joined the Naval Reserve Program, and by the time the United States was dragged into World War II, he was exactly where thousands of young men found themselves, staring at a war that was suddenly very real, very large, and very far away. But even among those thousands, Vraciu stood out. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the most polished. But he was one of those quietly intense personalities who pay attention to everything. The kind who doesn't just do what he's told. He watches, he compares, he remembers. And if you're going to defy standard procedure successfully in wartime, that's where it usually starts. By 1943, Vraciu had earned his wings and found himself posted to a name that carried serious weight in the U.S. Navy, Fighting Squadron 6, VF-6. The squadron's leading light was a man who was already a legend, Edward Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first flying ace and Medal of Honor recipient. And for a time, Alexander Vraciu flew as O'Hare's wingman. Imagine being in that position. You're fresh to the Pacific, flying off a carrier whose deck might as well be your entire world. And the man you're supposed to protect, support, and keep up with is the very pilot the rest of the Navy tells stories about. Wingman isn't a glamorous job. It's about discipline, patience, and above all, trust. You don't chase glory, you cover the leader. You do the job right. And sometimes that means not firing at all. From that vantage point, slightly behind and off to the side of one of the best, Vraciu got an early education in what separated a mere pilot from a hunter. It wasn't just aggressiveness, it was control. Butch O'Hare was famous not only for his daring, but for his calm precision. The man didn't spray and pray. When he opened fire, it meant something. And this is where the question of warning bullets really starts to matter. In every piece of wartime footage you've ever seen, tracers are the stars of the show. Bright lines tearing across the sky. They're dramatic. They look deadly. They're the visual language of aerial combat. But to the men who actually had to survive those duels at 300 knots, tracers were a double-edged sword. Here's how they worked. On a typical U.S. Navy fighter in World War II, like the F-6F Hellcat that Vraciu flew, each wing housed 3 caliber Browning machine guns. 6 guns total, each one fed by a long belt of linked ammunition. Those belts weren't all one kind of bullet. They were mixes, armor-piercing, incendiary, ball, and tracers. The usual pattern might be something like 4 regular rounds for every tracer, or 5 to 1 depending on the mission. The tracer rounds contained a small pyrotechnic charge in their base. When fired, that compound ignited, leaving a visible streak of light in flight, red, orange, or white, visible to the pilot. On paper, tracers were brilliant. They showed you where your bullets were going in real time. If you were missing behind the target, you could see that. You walked your fire forward. If you were leading too much, you corrected back. They also gave a certain emotional comfort. When you squeezed the trigger and saw those bright threads reaching out, you felt like you were doing something. You were in the fight, but there were problems. Big ones. First, ballistics. Tracer rounds didn't always behave exactly like the other bullets in the belt. They could be slightly lighter or heavier with different drag characteristics. That meant that if you aimed based on the tracers alone, you might not be putting the bulk of your fire exactly where you thought. Second, burnout distance. Many tracers stopped burning at a certain range, say 600 or 700 yards, while regular rounds kept flying. If you opened up too early, you might see your tracers burning out and assume the enemy was out of range, even as your unseen rounds continued uselessly into the ocean. And third, the most obvious, the most dangerous. If you could see your tracers, so could everyone else. Every burst of fire wasn't just a test of your aim. It was a neon arrow pointing straight back to your airplane. To the man in the other cockpit, those lines shouted, "Here I am!" To gunners on ships or in bombers, it was a gift. They didn't have to search the whole sky. They could just look along the graceful curve of glowing bullets and fire back at the source. Tracers weren't just tools. They were, in Vraciu's words, glowing invitations. Invitations to get killed. Now imagine you're Alexander Vraciu starting to rack up combat time in the Central Pacific. You've seen what tracers do for you and to you. You've watched Japanese pilots react the instant those first glowing rounds whip past their canopy, braking hard, juking out of your firing lane, snapping into a dive. You've seen pilots open fire too far out because the tracers look glorious at long range, only to waste half their ammunition spraying the ocean. By the time they close in, their ammo counters are nearly empty. You're not just guessing, you're noticing patterns, and you're the sort of person who, when you notice a pattern that gets people killed, wants to change it. By early 1944, Vraciu had already begun to make his own mark. He'd scored multiple victories in raids over places like Truk and the Marshalls. He'd also suffered a brutal blow, the loss of Butch O'Hare, shot down and killed in a night engagement in November 1943. The legend was gone, but the lessons weren't. Speed, surprise, fire discipline, hit first, hit hard, hit once. Those ideas were in Vraciu's head when he began questioning the very thing that almost every pilot took for granted, the glowing lines coming out of their guns. So he did something most didn't. He walked down to the people who actually touched the ammunition, the ordnance crew. If you've never thought about them, you're not alone. They're the quiet ones on the carrier deck, loading belts round by round, wrestling heavy guns into place, wiping grease from their hands with rags that will never be clean again. They weren't glamorous, but they were crucial. Vraciu asked them a simple question. Can we change what's in these belts? He wasn't asking for a new kind of bullet. The Navy already had what he wanted, the M8 armor-piercing incendiary round. M8's job was brutal and straightforward. It was designed to punch through aluminum skin, frames, and light armor and then ignite. If it hit a fuel tank or control cables or an engine, it didn't just poke holes, it started fires. It lit airplanes on fire from the inside. In a typical belt, M8 sat beside tracers and other rounds in a pattern that kept everything balanced. But Vraciu didn't want a pattern, he wanted purity. He told the ordnance men he wanted all M8. No tracer every fifth bullet, no glowing hints, just a thick, steady stream of armor-piercing incendiary. You can almost hear the reaction. You want to do what? To an ordnance chief whose job included sticking to regulations and keeping pilots alive, this sounded risky, even reckless. Tracers were considered standard for a reason. That's how pilots were trained. That's what the books said. But out at the sharp end of combat, sometimes the books give way to the man who has to pull the trigger. Vraciu pushed. He explained his reasoning. He talked about glowing invitations. He talked about surprise. He talked about not wanting the enemy to know he was firing until their wing was already coming off. And eventually, on his airplane, his guns, he got his way. 6 caliber Brownings, each fed by a belt that contained no visual cues at all. From that moment on, when he pulled the trigger, the camera wasn't going to see much. But the target was going to feel everything. Before we get to that famous 8-minute run, it's worth pausing on one question. If tracers were as dangerous as Vraciu believed, why did almost everyone else still use them? The answer tells you a lot about how militaries work and how humans think under pressure. Tracers did help, especially for inexperienced pilots. If you were new to combat, your sense of closure and deflection, the art of aiming not where the enemy is but where he will be, was shaky at best. Being able to see those bright streaks helped you learn quickly, or at least feel like you were. Instructors liked tracers. They could see where their trainees were aiming. They could correct based on visible evidence. It brought an invisible skill into view. And psychologically, tracers made pilots feel less alone. When you squeeze the trigger and nothing visible happens, it can be unsettling. Are my guns jammed? Am I hitting him? Did anything come out? When you squeeze the trigger and see a glowing torrent, you know I'm fighting back. That counts for something. So doctrine tended to err on the side of the majority. The average pilot, the one who needed help, the one who might panic. Tracer belts were, in a sense, designed for the lowest common denominator. But Alexander Vraciu wasn't aiming to be average. He was betting his life on being the exception, the man who didn't need the glow. Can you imagine making that choice yourself? Voluntarily giving up the thing that reassured you in exchange for a cold, invisible efficiency. Most of us cling to what makes us feel safer, even if it isn't actually safer. Vraciu did the opposite. By the summer of 1944, the stage for his greatest test was set. The United States had pushed across the Pacific in a grinding, island-by-island campaign. Names like Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Eniwetok had already cost blood and steel. The next giant step was the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Take those islands, and you put American long-range bombers within reach of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese Navy understood exactly how dangerous that was. They gathered what remained of their carrier force into the first Mobile fleet and moved to challenge the American invasion. On the other side, the U.S. brought its own hammer, Task Force 58, a powerful carrier task force with hundreds of Hellcats, Avenger torpedo bombers, and dive bombers ready to fly. It was June 19, 1944. On that morning, hundreds of miles from the islands being fought over by Marines below, the carrier war in the Pacific reached a kind of climax. From the decks of Japanese carriers, multiple waves of aircraft roared into the air. Fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, an entire airborne armada aimed at the American fleet. But they weren't sneaking up on anyone. American radar picked them up long before they arrived. What happened next would be remembered, somewhat unfairly, as a lopsided shooting gallery, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. U.S. pilots would later talk about Japanese planes falling in droves, often with only light losses in return. But in the moment in the cockpit, there was nothing easy or inevitable about it. For the American fighter pilots climbing to intercept, this was the day their training, their nerve, and their choices were tested all at once. Alexander Vraciu launched from the USS Lexington with Fighting Squadron 16, VF-16, into a sky that was about to become very crowded. He knew two things: the Japanese were coming, and they were hungry. They were also, compared to 1942, less experienced. Many of the veteran pilots who had fought at Coral Sea, Midway, and the early Solomons were gone. In their place were younger, less seasoned men with fewer flight hours and less carrier time. But numbers still matter. When you look up and see dozens of enemy aircraft in loose formation, all heading for the ships your friends live on, it doesn't matter how many hours they have. They can still drop bombs. Vraciu and his section climbed to an intercept altitude, using their superior radar guidance and better radios to position themselves ahead of one of the incoming groups. And here's where his earlier decision, those altered ammunition belts, was about to turn theoretical into real. Put yourself in his cockpit. The Lexington is now a speck far below. The Hellcat's big radial engine is a constant roar, steady but strained as you push into a climb. The air gets thinner, your ears pop. The canopy rattles slightly in the slipstream. You glance down at your instruments. Airspeed is good. Engine temps are in the green. You check your gun sight, centered, clear. And then you see them, first as dots, then as crosses, then as airplanes. A group of Japanese dive bombers, Yokosuka D4Y Judies, escorted by fighters, moving in formation toward your fleet. This is where most pilots feel the surge, the urge to start firing early at long range just to do something. To throw those glowing arcs of tracers out there like a warning or a challenge. But when Alexander Vraciu wraps his fingers around the Hellcat's gun trigger, he knows that nothing visible will come out. If he fires too soon, the enemy will never even know. They won't see tracers scything by, won't know to break. He can't fall into the tracer trap, wasting rounds based on what looks spectacular. He has to fly his approach with the old fighter pilot virtues, patience, closure, and geometry, so he closes. He gets in behind the bombers, high enough and fast enough to drop onto them. He wants to be close, inside 300 yards, even closer if he can. Think about that distance. 300 yards, 3 football fields. At a combined closing speed of hundreds of miles an hour. Any small change in angle, any slight misjudgment, and your gun sight swings off target. But if you wait, if you discipline yourself to wait until your target nearly fills that circle in your gun sight, when you squeeze the trigger, you don't need to hose. You only need a heartbeat of fire. That was Vraciu's style. Short bursts, no spray, no show. Exactly the sort of shooting that tracers tempted pilots away from. He rolled in behind the first duty. No one in that Japanese cockpit saw any warning glows. No sudden streaks ripping past their canopy, no fountains of light drawing their attention backward. From their perspective, one moment the sky was clear. The next, their airplane shuddered under impacts. 6 50-caliber machine guns spitting M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds into their tail and wings, invisible until the rounds struck, and then very visible indeed as metal skin peeled and fire blossomed. The first bomber went down. Most of us in that moment would be riding an adrenaline wave, tempted to keep the trigger down, to keep spraying until whatever was in front of us simply ceased to exist. But ammunition isn't infinite. In a Hellcat, yes, you had a lot, hundreds of rounds per gun, but in a furball, time blurs and triggers get heavy. Many pilots came back with near-empty belts and just a few kills to show for it. Alexander Vraciu had no intention of coming back light. He broke, repositioned, and fell in behind a second bomber. Same approach. Close, closer, closer still. Again, no warning tracers. Again, a precise burst. The Judy bucked, caught fire, and dropped away, leaving a smear of smoke against the clean blue sky. Third target. Fourth. At one point, he got so close that debris from a disintegrating bomber nearly hit his Hellcat. Wings, fabric, and fragments of structure filled his windscreen. Think about how hard it is to stop firing when the temptation is to keep your finger clamped down. To trust that your 1-second burst has done enough damage and flip your thumb off the trigger while your heart is hammering at your ribs. This is what invisible fire demands. Faith, not in luck, in your own aim. By the end of that pass, Alexander Vraciu had shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in roughly 8 minutes of combat, 6 airplanes, each with a crew, each with a bomb that would now never reach an American ship, and his ammunition. When the ordnance crew checked his guns back on the Lexington, they found he'd used just a fraction of what most pilots expended just checking that their weapons were working after takeoff. Less than a typical gun test. Imagine being that ordnance man, standing on the carrier deck after the chaos has died down, feeding the belts back out of the guns, counting the links. You know the stories spreading through the ready room. Vraciu nailed 6 today. You expect to find his belts nearly empty, loops of brass and steel hanging by a thread. But they aren't. Round after round of unused M8 clinks into the collecting tray. Invisible fire that hardly needed to burn at all. Back in the ready room, the mood would have been electric. Pilots who had survived the day swapped stories, sketched diagrams in the air with their hands, argued about who had seen what and who had shot who. Kill claims got written down, sometimes double-claimed, sometimes lost in the fog of war. In that swirl, one figure stood out, Alexander Vraciu, grinning, modest, but clearly carrying the calm energy of someone whose instincts had just been spectacularly vindicated. By that day's end, he was recognized as the Navy's leading ace, at least for that moment in the war, with a total of 19 aerial victories. Newsreels would soon carry his image. Newspapers would mention his name. The 6 in 8 minutes feat became one of those stories that traveled fast. But behind the headline was something more subtle, a lesson about how he chose to fight. He wasn't just lucky. He had stacked the probabilities in his favor by making a choice that went against the grain. He had taken away his glowing invitations. The Japanese pilots he faced that day died without ever seeing the lines that were killing them. Does that sound cold? Maybe it is. But that's the nature of air combat in a total war. There is no referee, there are no warnings. Your job isn't to frighten the enemy, it's to make sure he never has a chance to drop his bombs. In that sky over the Marianas, the most merciful thing a fighter pilot could do for his own side was to be brutally effective. So was Vraciu unique? Not entirely. He wasn't the only pilot to experiment with ammunition mixes or to mistrust tracers. Some British and German aces in Europe, flying very different aircraft, also preferred less trace in their belts for similar reasons. But what set Vraciu apart was how clearly the change showed up in that single, astonishing sortie, and how much it reflected his whole approach to flying. Remember, this was a man who had learned, as a wingman, to value discipline over drama. As he grew into a leading ace himself, that philosophy hardened. He once said, in effect, that he liked to get so close that he couldn't miss. It wasn't about long-range sniping. It was about closing the gap until the kill was almost guaranteed, and then having the self-control to fire just enough. Tracers worked against that mentality. They tempted you to fire earlier at slivers of targets at maybe ranges. Invisible fire punished that temptation. If you couldn't see your bullets, spraying them out at 700 yards felt pointless. You were forced to hold, until the enemy was big and real and impossible to miss. And when you finally fired, you saw the only evidence that really mattered, the enemy machine breaking apart. Think about your own life for a moment. How often do we cling to the tracers, the visible feedback, the things that make us feel like we're doing something, while ignoring the cold reality of whether we're actually effective? In war, that distinction can be fatal. For Vraciu, stripping away the visible comfort and relying on invisible performance wasn't some philosophical statement. It was necessity. Of course, his war didn't end with that one mission. He continued to fly, continued to fight, and continued to walk that narrow line between boldness and recklessness. In December 1944, off the Philippines, his luck appeared to run out. On a mission over Luzon, he was hit, this time not by an enemy fighter he could see, but by anti-aircraft fire from the ground. His Hellcat was no longer a match for gravity. He had to bail out. Parachuting into enemy-held territory, he was now something very different from the hunter in the sky, a stranded aviator on the wrong side of the lines. Yet even there, his story bent in an unusual direction. Rather than being captured, he linked up with Filipino guerrillas. For weeks, he moved with them, helped them, and watched a very different kind of war, a ground war of ambushes, sabotage, and survival. He eventually made it back to American lines and to the fleet, his flying days in the war essentially over. The Navy had other young men to send into the cockpit now. Vraciu had done more than his share. After the war, like so many veterans, he stepped back into a quieter life. He stayed in the Navy for a time, then moved into civilian work. The world moved on. Jet engines replaced propellers. Missiles replaced machine guns. The idea of closing to within a few hundred yards of an enemy aircraft and pulling a trigger faded into history. But his story stayed with those who care about the craft of air combat, because it sits at that fascinating intersection between technology and human judgment. The Hellcat was a superb fighter. The caliber Browning was a tough, proven gun. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary was a brutally effective round. The ordnance regs were written with care, and yet within that system a single pilot made a subtle change, removing a single category of bullet from his belts and changed the way he fought. It didn't make him invincible. It made him more himself, more aligned with his strengths, patience, gunnery, and an almost hunter's sense of when to strike. There's one more angle to this story we haven't explored yet, and it's an uncomfortable one. We've talked about invisible fire as a tactical advantage, but what did it feel like on the receiving end? For the men in those Japanese aircraft, the experience of facing an American fighter like Vraciu would have been radically different depending on whether he used tracers. With tracers, you at least got that split second of warning. The sky around you lit up. You saw the streaks coming in. You felt the primal jolt of fear, yanked the stick, dove, rolled. Sometimes you escaped, sometimes you didn't. But psychologically, you weren't taken entirely by surprise. Without tracers, the sky stayed deceptively calm. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the streak of colored light. It was the aircraft around you beginning to shed parts, or the sudden appearance of a bright orange tongue of flame crawling along your wing. To die like that is, in a sense, to be murdered by geometry. By someone who, out of sight and unheard over the roar of your own engine, calculated your future position, slid into it, and filled it with unseen steel. Is that more frightening, more merciful, or simply more efficient? In a war that had already seen cities burned to ash, civilians vaporized by blast, and ships full of men sent to the bottom, the notion of a warning shot takes on a strange, almost naive quality. When Vraciu called tracers glowing invitations, he was mocking exactly that idea, that in a duel where the object is to kill, you would voluntarily announce every move. The truth is that in the air there was no room for chivalry as Hollywood likes to imagine it. No leisurely duels where pilots politely circled each other before engaging. By 1944, it was ambushes all the way down. Radar, radio, high-altitude vectors, boom and zoom attacks, dive in, fire, climb away. In that environment, the man who gave fewer warnings lived longer. So what does any of this mean now, in an age where dogfights are rare, and the most lethal weapons are missiles fired from beyond visual range? You could argue that Alexander Vraciu's choice about tracer rounds was a small step in a long trend. The trend toward making killing as invisible, as sudden, and as one-sided as possible. From musket volleys you could see and hear, to shells arcing from over the horizon, to machine gun rounds invisible in flight, to missiles that arrive before their target knows they've been fired. Modern war is, in many ways, the story of disappearing warnings. Yet there's another way to read his story, not as a step toward faceless warfare, but as an example of how individual judgment still matters, even in a machine-heavy environment. The Hellcat's designers didn't stand beside him on that carrier deck when he asked for his belts to be reloaded. The tactics manuals weren't there in the cockpit when he decided how close to get before firing. He was. It was his eyes, his hands, his mind. The choice to remove tracers was, yes, tactical, but it was also deeply personal, a reflection of his willingness to take responsibility for his outcomes rather than lean on what everyone else did. Ask yourself, in your own field, whatever it is, are you flying with someone else's tracers? Are you relying on the visible, the conventional, the thing that everyone tells you is necessary, even if your own experience tells you it's not actually helping? Are there glowing invitations you'd be better off without? Maybe that's the deeper resonance of this WWII story. Beneath the gunfire, the roaring engines, and the black and white newsreels, it's a reminder that progress doesn't always look like adding more. Sometimes it looks like taking something away. Alexander Vraciu died in 2015 at the age of 96. By then, the world he had flown through, the cramped cockpits, the smell of high-octane fuel, the feeling of a carrier deck trembling under your boots as planes launched, was as distant to most people as sailcloth and cannon smoke. But if you sit down and listen to the men who were there, a theme emerges. The machines mattered, the tactics mattered, the technology mattered, but what really made the difference again and again were the minds of the people operating them. The pilot who noticed that tracers gave away more than they gave back, the ordnance man willing to trust that pilot enough to rebelt his guns, the squadron leaders who let their aces quietly tweak doctrine in the name of survival. That's how real change happens. Not with a grand memo, with small, specific choices. On June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea, one of those choices manifested in spectacular fashion. 6 enemy planes falling in 8 minutes, cut down by bullets no one could see until it was too late. And when Alexander Vraciu climbed out of his Hellcat that day, smelling of sweat and cordite, hearing the distant sounds of ships still at general quarters, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He'd never put those warning bullets back in his guns. Because in a sky where nobody gets a warning, the last thing you ever want to send the enemy is a glowing invitation.